one's pushing me out. I'm not leaving. The president yesterday on a conference call with his campaign staff and notably also with Vice President Harris. Let me say this as clearly and simply as I can. I'm running. I'm the Democratic Party's nominee. No one is pushing me out. I'm not leaving. I'm in this race to the end. The president's fundraising email last night. I had a bad night. I screwed up. The president to a radio interviewer last night. All of us said we pledged our support to him, said Kathy Hochul after 20 governors met with Mr. Biden last night. Is he fit for office? Somebody asked Tim Walz on the way out. Yes. We would stand with him, Wes Moore says he told the president. Joe Biden's had our back. Now it is our turn to have his, said Gavin Newsom. And I understand what the governors said and why. And I understand why the president said what he said. And I understand why the email reads as it does. And I understand he may fully or nearly fully believe all of that. And I do not understand what they are doing at the White House. I don't understand it. The New York Times led a succession of reports yesterday. The gist of all of them was President Biden had told an ally, quoting the Times, that he is weighing whether to continue in the race. Although perhaps crucially, after the White House issued a flat denial, the Times altered the hook in that story and the story itself to focus on the idea that instead, quote, he may not be able to salvage his candidacy if he cannot convince voters that he is up to the job, which sounds like what you do before you weigh whether or not to continue in the race. All of which I understand. I do not understand the litmus test the president and his advisors have apparently convinced themselves will be the magic wand. I'll quote the Times again. Mr. Biden's allies said that the president had privately acknowledged that his next few appearances heading into the July 4th holiday weekend must go well. Particularly an interview scheduled for Friday with George Stephanopoulos of ABC News and campaign stops in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. The interview with George is not live. It is taped. The campaign stops in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin seem to be the standard ones, presumably going to follow all the other campaign stops with teleprompters. If someone is telling the president that doing well in totally controlled, utterly contained, hothouse environments is going to quell in the slightest the impact that continues to resonate from a week ago in Atlanta, they are crazy. And if the president thinks doing what amounts to canned events will quell the impact, he is doomed. And between them, if he gets through a pre-recorded, sit-down interview that gets cut up into parts for the various ABC news shows, which is what ABC says it is doing with Mr. Biden, and he gets through 2 speeches, and there are not questions from reporters, or at minimum, questions from the crowd, and he and the campaign boast about all these events as some kind of triumph, then the outcome will be this. President Biden will have forced himself off the ticket, not because of the debate, but because of the week after the debate. The way to steer out of the skid, the way to find the magic wand, the way to salvage his candidacy, as the Times put it, save his re-election bid, as CNN put it, stay in the race, as ABC put it, was, and perhaps still is, to hold a news conference. And I mean call a news conference for 20 minutes from now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. You get there if you can. Not a news conference next week at the NATO summit in D.C., but now. And take whatever they got for you. And then to do a town hall somewhere, or as Jim Clyburn says, a series of town halls. And if you want some comparatively comfortable exercise in the middle of that Stephanopoulos interview has got to be live. And it would be best to do these things on consecutive days. I do not understand what they are doing at the White House. And let me say for the 1,000th time, I love Joe Biden. When it hit me Tuesday afternoon that between the Pelosi remarks, about the test, about the legitimacy of the questions, and the harrowing leaked swing state internals, the God help me vibe had just changed, and the tipping point had been reached. When I realized that, my heart broke. I want Joe Biden to find the magic wand. I want him to be the nominee. I want him to get up at his second inauguration and give all of us the finger and become the first American president to highlight his swearing in by swearing at everybody. And he can swear at me personally. And I don't think it's going to happen because I don't understand what the hell they are doing at the White House. In response to a request for comment, White House spokesman Andrew Bates said that, quote, it is false to suggest there is any openness to ending the campaign, end quote. That to CNN, and it's finessed just enough to give a little wiggle room because if the president retires from the ticket, I am sure the word openness will not have applied to the process. The polls are awful. The New York Times poll, they were asked, do you agree with this statement? Quote, Joe Biden is just too old to be an effective president. 84% of registered voters under the age of 45 said they agreed with that statement. 83% of Hispanic voters. 64% of voters 65 and over. In the horse race, 3 other new polls and the Times and the previous 6 taken since the debate have shown an average shift away from Biden of about 1.5 points in a week. But the polls are not fatal because almost none of that Democratic loss went to Trump, despite his opponent having as calamitous a one-night event as any presidential campaign has had since Bob Dole fell off the stage into the crowd at a campaign rally in 1996. Trump has still only picked up 0.3 of 1 point since the debate. So the Democrats could regain that. They could regain the whole 1.5 if Joe Biden proves the debate was an anomaly, and it's not as if proving that is impossible. If it is impossible for him, another Democrat could regain that. On that subject, I have to say I think we can rule out the idea that if he leaves the ticket, he should also leave the White House. Though I watched the confirmation hearings for Nelson Rockefeller that went on through half of my senior year in high school, I had bluntly forgotten, and I apologize to you, a new vice president has to be approved separately by the Senate and the House. And why would I think the House Republican majority might stonewall any vice presidential nominee sent in by a new President Kamala Harris just because if the post were to remain open, this weasel speaker Mike Johnson would then be first in line for the presidency? Anyway, I have 2 other things to mention on this 4th of July that are either relevant or true. The first is the incident at the White House press room. My friend Kelly O'Donnell, Tim Russert used to call us, well, she used to call her KO, and he used to call me KO number 2. Kelly O'Donnell, now president of the Correspondents Association and still with NBC News, was asking for the president to himself come to the press room and tell reporters himself that he was still running, rather than have the press secretary do it. She was saying this and doing it very politely and professionally when she was interrupted by somebody neither polite nor professional.
He's absolutely running.
Yeah. Well, he's saying that, and I'm sharing with you his view.
And we would invite the president to come here and tell us that directly.
Noted, Kelly.
But
he's awake.
That's inappropriate.
As you heard from your colleague, the president of the WHA, that's inappropriate. Thank you, Kelly.
A note about that idiot who said, if he's awake. That was identified as James Rosen. He used to be a big deal at Fox. And then there was a sexual harassment saga, and they fired him. And he's at Newsmax now. And not to diminish the harassment, but this may even be more telling about how disconnected from reality this idiot is. I put him on the worst persons list years ago. Something idiotic he said at Fox. And as I recall, we had two really good nominees on the list, and we needed a third one, and I kind of stretched to put him in there because who the hell is James Rosen? I swear to God, a couple of days later, I get at my office an angry, multi-page letter from James Rosen explaining what a brilliant reporter he is and how many awards he has won and how dare I, and Fox has better ratings than I do. And attached to this multi-page, virulent, venomous letter is his resume. Lastly, back to the current issue and a disease I have discussed here before called anosognosia. As the legend David Dunning of the Dunning-Kruger syndrome wrote once, an anosognosic patient who is paralyzed simply does not know that he is paralyzed. If you put a pencil in front of them and ask them to pick up the pencil in front of their left hand, they won't do it. And you ask them why, and they'll say, well, I'm tired. Or, I don't need a pencil. I don't think David Dunning made that pencil reference randomly. It mainlines back to the president who in his lifetime was actually credited with saving the pencil industry in this country, President Woodrow Wilson. Now, the experts, more than a century later, are still studying the stroke that Woodrow Wilson suffered while on his cross-country tour to try to sell the League of Nations to America over the heads of a disapproving Senate. The deduction has been widespread in the ensuing decades that whether or not he had the disease earlier, because evidently he had had strokes earlier, after the stroke in 1919, Woodrow Wilson showed all the signs of anosognosia. In the 1970s, the neuropsychiatrist Edwin Weinstein was granted access to the Woodrow Wilson papers, and he wrote, after reviewing them carefully, quote, "Following his stroke, the outstanding feature of the president's behavior was his denial of his incapacity. Denial of illness, or anosognosia, literally lack of knowledge of disease, is a common sequel of the type of brain injury received by Wilson. In this condition, the patient denies or appears unaware of such deficits as paralysis or blindness. To casual observers, anosognosiac patients may appear quite normal and even bright and witty. When not on the subject of their disability, they are quite rational, and tests of their intelligence may show no deficit," unquote. Unfortunately, when you turn to the subject of his disability, President Wilson was anything but rational. His Secretary of State was a man named Robert Lansing, and Lansing dutifully summoned the entire cabinet to a meeting to discuss the illness of Woodrow Wilson after the stroke. President Wilson or his wife promptly forced the resignation of Secretary of State Lansing. Doctors who challenged Woodrow Wilson about his stroke were dismissed. People who knew him before his stroke and knew there was a problem and knew there was a difference were eased out or denied access. Woodrow Wilson insisted until his death that while, yes, he'd had a stroke, it affected only his walking, and it affected his walking only a little bit. It's a terrifying disease. One of the supposed allies, and it looks like there were two of them, and they became sources between them for the Times and ABC and CNN stories on Joe Biden. One of the supposed allies insisted the president was not oblivious to his situation. So I am not saying that anosognosia is part of this equation. Also, you do not have to have anosognosia or anything else impairing your judgment to be unrealistic or to underplay your own health troubles or your own age troubles. I turned 65 this year, and the last thing I want to deal with is the reality that I'm 65. I will see myself in the mirror and go, that can't be right, I'm 22. But as you consider what is happening, as this unfolds to whatever conclusion it unfolds to, keep this or something else like it in the back of your mind. It may also be in play. Denial is a colloquial term. Anosognosia is a medical term. Reality, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. Me, as a rapidly aging 65-year-old, I just wanted a day off. Well, maybe next year in the Trump re-education camp. In the interim, hey, did you know it's July 4th? I have wanted to tell the story on a July 4th for a lot of July 4ths now. The story is about how the media, in real time, mistreated someone famous associated with the holiday in a way that is now literally unbelievable to people who still respect the person in question. How newspaper columnists in 1939 and 1940 insisted that the great and tragic Lou Gehrig, the baseball player, was A, faking his illness, and B, had infected all of his teammates with it. That's next. This is Countdown. Now to July 4th and some unexpected lessons. It's still topical. This is about what happens when you make the mistake of thinking that the media is not self-serving, when you wrongly believe that it does not look for the negative, when you foolishly expect it to own up to its own disasters rather than try to bury them. And particularly relevant to this last week with President Biden and the media, whatever the outcome, whatever the truth here, there is a subtext. If Joe Biden retires from the ticket because he's old or he has an illness or for whatever reason, that would validate what the writers wrote, especially the writers in the New York Times. And the seamy underbelly to dogged reporting is reporters like nothing better than to first catch crap for their story and then have their story proved true after all, even if it weren't true when they wrote it. So sometimes they write really, really bad stories, unbelievable stories, stories that should be chiseled into their gravestones. This is not per se about Joe Biden, nor about politics, nor about 2024 for that matter. It may, however, be a metaphor for all of the above. The further we have gotten from Tuesday, July 4th, 1939, the further it has been evident that this was probably the most poignant day in the history of American sports, and one of the most poignant days in the history of America. That day was when 61,808 people crowded into Yankee Stadium in New York to hear Lou Gehrig say goodbye. He had been stricken by ALS, and as much as everybody tried to pretend it was not a death sentence, or at least not likely to be a death sentence, it is, in retrospect, clear that nearly all the fans knew. It was, in fact, so clear at the time that the Yankees and even officials of the city of New York were insistent that during the ceremonies between games of that day's doubleheader, that Lou Gehrig should not make a speech. They literally believed that the amount of grief in the ballpark among the fans and the employees and the players would somehow be too much for, at minimum, the mental health of everybody there. They did not know how that much sadness could be handled in public. Of course, Lou Gehrig spoke anyway. And all he did was give one of the bravest and most moving speeches in human history, one that is repeated, word for word, in ballparks and elsewhere, every year on its anniversary, July 4th. So we view that July 4th, 1939, as a day of grief and sorrow and love and of that rarest of emotions, of our shared awareness of the implacability of death, and that our victories over death must be temporary and symbolic. We see, through hindsight, Lou Gehrig Day, Yankee Stadium, the Bronx, New York, Tuesday, July 4th, 1939, as a unanimous gathering bathed in sympathy and empathy, representing the sympathy and empathy of a nation. And we do that because the baseball world and the media have spent the intervening decades burying the work of those in its ranks in 1939 who approached Lou Gehrig's illness as either, prepare yourself, as either a fraud or a conspiracy. I am going to read you in full 2 articles about Lou Gehrig that must be tied for the all-time worst pieces written in American media history, and on the list of the worst things ever written for publication in the English language. The second article is actually not from 1939. It's from August 1940, and in it, the sports editor of the New York Daily News all but accuses Lou Gehrig of being what we would now call a super spreader and speculates that Gehrig has infected all the other Yankee players with his disease. The first article actually ran in hundreds of American newspapers on the night of Monday, July 3rd, 1939, but mostly the morning of July 4th. It was in a column distributed by United Press, the precursors to United Press International, where I made my full-time professional debut 40 years later, almost to the day, in July of 1979. When I worked there, I had never heard about this article. Throughout the bulk of my career, I had never heard about this article. I did not know of this article until the microfilm files of newspapers migrated onto the internet in the late 90s, and to this day, I have never found any indication that the writer ever apologized or ever admitted his stupidity and coarseness and insensitivity and awfully timed glibness. The writer's name was Jack Cuddy. Jack Cuddy, C-U-D-D-Y. He began as a news reporter for the Milwaukee Journal after World War I. He worked for newspapers in Chicago, Miami, New Orleans, and then joined United Press in 1926. He was a news reporter. He helped cover Lindbergh's solo flight over the Atlantic in 1927. And then in 1932, they made him their primary boxing reporter, and they also assigned him to write columns about all sports that would sent out on the UP wire to all of the newspapers that subscribed. We don't know how many of them ran this. Their sports editors probably found out just how many of their readers actually read it. Because by the time Jack Cuddy wrote this, he had been a national sports reporter for 7 years and a journalist, a hard news reporter, for about 15 before that. This still is what untold readers of papers that carried the work of United Press read just hours before Lou Gehrig gave his luckiest man on the face of the earth speech. In this corner, Jack Cuddy writes on The Retirement of Lou Gehrig by Jack Cuddy, New York. There's only one thing I see wrong about the celebration of the 4th of July, and that's the national shedding of tears about a husky named Lou Gehrig, which will be climaxed with a Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day during the doubleheader between the Yanks and Washington at Yankee Stadium. The playwrights for this Gehrig business at the stadium are making the affair so touching. I understand that even the little boys and gals of our vast land will be unable to set off firecrackers and things because of the tears that trickle down upon their matches and punks. The whole business seems goofy and uncalled for to me. I see no reason for pulling a Paul over a holiday when everyone should be having lots of fun and peanuts, popcorn, Cracker Jacks, and hot dogs. Particularly, I see no reason for pulling this Yankee publicity stunt about Gehrig, who is the last man in the world who would go for it unless the Yankee brass hats and New York baseball writers snaffled him and forced him into it. Gehrig knows, and so should everyone else connected with baseball, that the 36-year-old first baseman of the Yanks was through with top-flight play just as soon as he showed up at the Yanks training camp at St. Pete. But because Lou was the Iron Horse, the man who had written into the records that all-time mark of 2,130 consecutive championship games, his fade-out had to be different from that of the ordinary player. Accordingly, Gehrig was sent to a nationally known center of health investigation to see what was wrong with him. I'll guarantee that if 90% of the men, women, and children in America were sent to that particular spot, we would learn that each and all had something wrong with them, even if it were only halitosis, athlete's foot, warts, or BO. I've forgotten exactly what they said was wrong with Gehrig. Oh, yes, I do recall that the first hospital report indicated infantile paralysis, a very vague breed. But later the experts explained it wasn't infantile paralysis at all. It was something else. The ailment had one of those highfalutin names that only people with plenty of dough or prestige can have. Personally, I don't care what Gehrig has got, but I'd like to exchange my body for his during the next 40 or 50 years, let us say. And I'm pretty sure I'd do all right, regardless of the experts' argument over the Latin or Greek declensions of what Laraping Lou may or may not have. It seems to me that Gehrig was merely getting too old to play hell-for-leather baseball, and that the scientists of ailments or advertising gave him a graceful exit. But what really brings water to my eyes on this particular 4th of July is the plight of Monty Stratton, a lad who was right in his prime, only 25 years old, a lad who never had the chance to amass the fortune that must be Gehrig's. Gehrig, too old for championship baseball, will be out there tomorrow with his mysterious ailment, able to get about as actively as anyone of his piano-legged build should at 36. But poor Monty Stratton is hobbling about the coach's box of the Chicago White Sox with an artificial leg, clinking about where his own right leg should be. There is no question about what happened to Stratton. He shot himself in the leg accidentally while hunting down Texas way last November, and the right leg had to be amputated at the knee. At the time this accident happened, Stratton stood out as one of the best right-handed flingers in the American League. They gave him a Stratton Day in Chicago this season, and he got about $20,000 out of it, about the same as his salary for a year. Gehrig has been named non-playing captain for the All-Star Interleague game at Yankee Stadium a week from Tuesday, along with tomorrow's Gehrig Day, but it seems to me that poor Monty Stratton could have been appointed batting practice pitcher, at least for the All-Star game. And if we've got to shed tears tomorrow for some afflicted ball player, let's give them off for poor Monty instead of for Lucky Lou. Jack Cuddy, everybody. 23 months later, Lou Gehrig was dead. Monty Stratton, the innocent bystander in this Hindenburg of a sports column, who had been on a possible Hall of Fame trajectory, actually made a comeback on one leg, and 7 years later in the low minor leagues, he won 18 games pitching for the Sherman Twins of the East Texas League. He pitched sporadically thereafter until the age of 41. By then, a film version based on his life had been made. It starred Jimmy Stewart. Monty Stratton died in 1982, 7 years and 1 week after the writer Jack Cuddy died. Jack Cuddy had himself died 34 years after Lou Gehrig died and 36 years after he had offered to trade bodies with Lou Gehrig. Not only did Mr. Cuddy never apparently correct the Gehrig article, but United Press apparently did not punish him in any way for having written it. He continued to cover boxing for UP and UPI for another 25 years, and his obituary appeared in the New York Times. did not mention his column about Lou Gehrig. When a man named Jimmy Powers died in February of 1995, he too got an obit in the Times, and it too did not mention his Lou Gehrig article, which is, believe it or not, probably much worse than Jack Cuddy's. Jimmy Powers' article appeared on Sunday, August 18, 1940. It covered much of 2 pages in the New York Daily News. Powers was sports editor there from 1936 until his retirement in 1959. He would eventually, grudgingly, sparingly apologize for this uneducated dreck that he wrote, but I worked with people at the start of my career who had worked with him. It was only about 20 years between us. They said it was clear that he continued to believe that it was likely that he was right and that Gehrig had somehow infected his Yankee teammates with some kind of milder version of ALS that cost them the 1940 American League pennant. No, I am not kidding. The New York Daily News, August 18, 1940, the headline read, "Has polio hit the Yankees?" The Yankees, who for the past 4 years have been one of the greatest baseball machines in history and almost universally selected to win the pennant again, have collapsed. Why? Has the mysterious polio germ, which felled Lou Gehrig, also struck his former teammates, turning a once great team into a floundering non-contender? According to overwhelming opinion of the medical profession, poliomyelitis, similar to infantile paralysis, is communicable. The Yanks were exposed to it at its most acute stage. They played ball with the afflicted Gehrig, dressed and undressed in the locker room with him, traveled, played cards, and ate with him. Isn't it possible some of them also became infected? It's hard to believe mere coincidence can explain away the wholesale failure of the individuals. In Gehrig's case, one of the most prominent symptoms was loss of muscular power. The same symptom can be found in many of the Yanks today. So far, no one has been able to advance a satisfactory reason for it. Not without precedent. The possibility of wholesale team infection is not entirely without precedent. Last fall, the Loyola University football team was faced with the same menace from infantile paralysis, a greatly similar disease, communicated in the same manner. A player collapsed in the dressing room, was rushed to a hospital where it was determined he had developed paralysis. The entire squad was quarantined and examined. 2 other players were discovered bearing the germ caught from their unfortunate teammate. Luckily, the infection was detected at the earliest stage. Injections killed the germ and brought complete recovery. In the Textbook of Nervous Disorders by Robert Bing, professor of neurology at the University of Basel in Switzerland, are found the following pertinent facts. 1. The disease appears in a majority of cases between the ages of 30 and 55. Most of the players with the Yanks are in their 30s. With the exception of Gordon, the others are close to them. 2. Among causes found for the disease are overexposure to cold, an exhausting disease, or, capital letters, overexertion. Ball players certainly are called upon for more than normal exertion, as were the Yanks at a time when they were exposed to the germ. 3. Regarding the effect on the legs, where it probably would be most noticeable in ball players. For a comparatively long period of time, the lower extremities remain normal except for marked exaggeration of their reflexes. Atrophy of the leg muscles may not occur until the late stages of the disease. Unquote. Thus, a player might be able to run and move as well as ever while the germ was sapping his strength in less noticeable parts, such as hands, arms, and shoulders. Club players worried. Club officials and players have been worried that such a general infection existed. they took special precautionary measures to prevent it. Individual drinking cups were provided. Each player took care to use only his own towel. Special provisions were made for laundering uniforms and underclothing. Among the players, Bill Dickey last winter made a special trip to the Mayo Brothers Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, for a thorough physical checkup. This coming winter, Atlee Donald, Red Rolfe, and several others are considering similar checkups. The fear of the disease had a psychological effect. It preyed on the minds of the athletes, exaggerated minor aches, pains, and ailments which ordinarily they would have ignored. Practically, the entire club had noticed Gehrig's symptoms, became aware of, and worried about nervous and muscular reactions they had never been conscious of previously. Club officials believe they have finally defeated this psychological sword of Damocles. These nervous and muscular reactions could always be traced to an injury, a slight bump or bruise. This, apparently, was the savior. For in Gehrig's case, no injury could be traced down to explain his early symptoms. However, the shadow of doubt must still linger, for in the same volume by Professor Bing is this, quote, I have described a case of traumatic median neuritis which later developed into a typical lateral amyotrophic sclerosis. The note, the latter is the medical term for Gehrig's ailment and indicates that the particular form of paralysis which afflicted Gehrig might develop from neuritis. Olbermann note, no, not quite. Dr. Robert F. Walsh, Yank physician and surgeon, and Earl V. Painter, Yank trainer, each nationally famous in his profession, are the men closest to the physical well-being of the players. They answer emphatically that no such condition exists on the club. Here is Dr. Walsh's opinion, quote, though at first there was a very definite possibility of the entire team becoming afflicted, there is now no indication of it. Had the disease stricken, there would have been a noticeable change in the physical appearance of those to whom the disease had been communicated. There would not be the slightest doubt remaining that the stricken individual or individuals were infected. Unquote. Medics support Walsh. Dr. Walsh's statement is supported by the current medical belief that the infection will reveal itself within 6 weeks of the time of contact. However, with the medical profession admitting a meager knowledge of the disease, there is the possibility a lingering means of infection exists, that the disease may be communicated in a different form, and that it may be chronic as well as acute, as in Gehrig's case. Thus, the possibility that the Yanks are so infected still exists. Doc Painter, in an equally definite denial, takes a different slant. He says, quote, in view of the circumstances, I can understand how one might be led to a plausible hypothesis that the team has been stricken with this disease. However, I have absolutely no belief in it. There is no similarity between the symptoms of these individual cases and Gehrig's. Lou suffered from deterioration of the nervous system. The trouble with these other boys is something entirely different. To point out one example, Rolfe suffers from a blood rather than a nervous disorder. Are Yanks infected? Nevertheless, there is another point to be remembered. Gehrig slipped perceptibly as a ball player about mid-season in 1938. Almost a year later, when he reported for spring training, there was still no suspicion he was afflicted by this disease. In fact, not until June, when he visited the Mayo Clinic, was his ailment definitely determined. All of which apparently leaves a complete and final answer still to be made. Something has happened to the Yanks. If Gehrig passed through a stage in which the cause of his ineffectiveness was undetermined, isn't it possible such is also the case with many of the Yanks today? Jimmy Powers' article, August 1940. Accompanying that, by the way, which I have spared you, was a sidebar, a 2 or 3 line analysis of the underperformances of 10 specific Yankee players, ending in bold-faced print with this final word from Jimmy Powers. Can coincidence explain these simultaneous ailments? Couldn't the polio germ be the common cause? No, it couldn't, you idiot. That morning that was published, Lou Gehrig, who did not have polio, who did not have the other disease described by Dr. Bing, Lou Gehrig had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and he had 289 more days to live. Jimmy Powers was not suspended by the New York Daily News, not demoted, not fired, not branded with a scarlet letter A for asshole, or anything else. In fact, he became one of the first sports writers to move into television as a commentator on NBC's Friday Night Fights in the 50s. I did not read you these to spoil your July 4th, nor any other of your days, nor to darken the commemorations and remembrances of Lou Gehrig. I read them just to provide a little perspective on media and opinion and the strongest, most unstoppable force in the world, a journalist who thinks he's right, even though everybody else around him begs him to realize that he's wrong. Occasionally, that motivation gives us things like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein and Watergate reporting. Occasionally, it gives us Bob Woodward sitting on tapes of Trump admitting as it began that COVID would be airborne and a disaster, sitting on those tapes until Woodward could get himself a book deal. And occasionally, it gives us Jack Cuddy implying Lou Gehrig has a cold, and Jimmy Powers insisting Lou Gehrig had irresponsibly infected his teammates with a disease he didn't have, but Powers thought he did because part of the original diagnosis included a reference to another disease with the word polio in it. I've done all the damage I can do here, but not as much as Jack Cuddy and Jimmy Powers. And how many Jack Cuddys and Jimmy Powers do we read every day on politics in this country? Enjoy July 4th. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on guitars, bass, and drums, and Mr. Chanel handled the orchestration and the keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, were arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. That's Countdown for this, the 125th day until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,277th day since convicted felon Donald J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the July 11th sentencing hearing. Use the mental health system. Use all of it to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is Tuesday, bulletins as the news warrants. Until the next one, I'm Keith Olbermann. Happy July 4th. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.